Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission is always to take a stack of sources, the dense articles, the conflicting historical accounts, the raw research, and distill it into the sharpest, most surprising understanding possible, giving you the shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Our subject today is perhaps one of the most contradictory figures in world history, a man whose sheer brilliance really forces us to challenge every definition of success and empire. We are diving deep into the world of Timur.
Right, the Turco-Mongol conqueror, best known to Europeans as Tamerlane.
Or perhaps more accurately, Timur the Lame, a nickname that came from an injury he sustained early in his life.
And when you look at the sheer scope of his power, the map of his conquests is genuinely staggering. This is a man who, in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, created an empire that stretched from Syria, across Persia, Central Asia, practically to the borders of China.
And his military record is, well, it's almost spotless.
Almost. It seems completely spotless. He successfully sacked Delhi, utterly humiliating the Delhi Sultanate. He captured the mightiest ruler in the West, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, at the monumental Battle of Ankara.
An event that plunged the Ottomans into a decades-long civil war. He didn't just defeat them, he shattered them for a generation.
And he also fundamentally broke the power of the Golden Horde by defeating Toqamish. So by pretty much every historical metric you could use, he was undefeated in battle.
And that, for you, is the central puzzle we must solve in this deep dive. It's the big question. If he was such an unparalleled military genius, if he possessed the logistical and strategic power to conquer and devastate these massive, wealthy territories, northern India, Anatolia, the vast Tatar lands, why?
Why didn't he keep them?
Exactly. Why did he consistently, repeatedly choose not to permanently annex them? Why did he refuse to invest the effort, the manpower, the resources required to establish a lasting, centralized governmental structure in these regions?
It seems like a fundamental failure of long-term vision. Wouldn't true genius be building something that lasts? Isn't withdrawing proof that the administrative overhead was just too high for him to handle?
And that's the core tension. The sources indicate it wasn't simply a failure, it was a deliberate strategy that fundamentally defined the nature of Timurid power. He prioritized dominance over durable administration.
So our mission today is to really analyze exactly how that choice was made.
Right. We need to explore his unique management style, the true motives behind his conquests, and why he preferred the immediate, terrifying impact of conquest over the long-term institutional stability of empire. This is really the only way to understand his complex, conflicting legacy, which includes both, genocidal brutality on a scale that's hard to imagine, and a spectacular cultural flowering known as the Timurid Renaissance.
Okay, let's unpack this central contradiction then, the limits of his ambition. If you were going to put together a massive army, say 200,000 strong.
An almost unprecedented number for that era, by the way.
Right, and march it halfway across the continent to Delhi, sack the city, kill tens of thousands, and take immense plunder. The natural assumption is that the goal must be permanent annexation, long-term extraction of wealth. That's what empires do.
That assumption is precisely what Timur flips on its head. The sources suggest that permanent, stable administrative rule was, surprisingly, secondary to the immediate short-term gain.
Secondary?
Completely. The primary motivations for these long-distance campaigns were much more immediate and, you could say, visceral. They were about acquiring immediate wealth through loot, enhancing his personal power, and critically burnishing his reputation, his prestige.
So it wasn't about planting flags and setting up permanent tax collection agencies across the whole of Eurasia.
Not at all.
It was about creating fear, demonstrating strength, and getting an immediate cash flow.
That's the strategic payoff. Conquering land to rule over was perpetually secondary to the instant benefits of destruction, ransom, and loot. Timur's campaigns were essentially vast strategic demonstrations of his superior power. They were designed to weaken all of his major rivals simultaneously.
So in these vast swaths of land, you mentioned northern India, Syria, Anatolia, the Kipchak steppe, what was the actual policy?
In those places, Timur was content with collecting ransom money, destroying any organized opposition he found, and chastising unfriendly local leaders. He'd make an example of them. No permanent administration was ever established. He'd come in, break everything, take the valuables, and leave.
That makes the resulting political structure inherently fragile, doesn't it? If the entire regime is based on the charisma and power of just one person, it's not really an empire in the traditional sense. It's more like a temporary coalition held together by fear.
Precisely. Timur did not rule. nor did he ever truly aspire to rule a centralized bureaucratic empire in the style of, say, the later Ottomans or the Mughals. He ruled, and this is a key phrase from the sources, through people, not institutions.
What does that mean in practice?
It means that all loyalty, military, administrative, and political, devolved only to him. Personally, he was the center of gravity for the entire system. Everything and everyone answered to Nimr, not to an office or a state.
Which explains perfectly why the unified empire just fractured so rapidly after his death in 1405. The system couldn't function without its central figure.
Absolutely. When the individual was gone, the central authority just vanished. The unified empire collapsed rapidly, dissolving into warring principalities ruled by his sons and grandsons.
So it wasn't built to last.
The unified empire wasn't. But, and this is an important distinction, we should note that Timurid princes did continue to rule Central Asia. They maintained control over his core lands for over a century, which demonstrates the relative stability of his original power base. The core was solid, the periphery was designed to be fluid.
But the constant campaigning, marching armies thousands of miles from his capital in Samarkand to Delhi and back, that requires staggering logistics. It must have been exhausting for everyone involved. Why the continuous, almost mandatory need for warfare? Why couldn't he just sit in Samarkand and rule the territories he already controlled?
Because warfare was an essential, continuous necessity. It was driven by the internal political dynamics of his nomadic-style army.
He had to keep him busy.
Busy, loyal, and crucially, fed with booty. His massive fighting force was the core component of his power. And an army that large that's not getting paid or, getting rich from plunder is a dangerous army. When the sources describe his campaigns, they note that the need for resources was perpetual.
So he had built a system where the costs of the military structure itself demanded constant conquest.
Exactly. The administrative overhead and the political necessity of keeping his commanders and troops rich meant that peace was, ironically, unsustainable. It was too expensive.
That's fascinating. The sources even note that he pressed on with campaigns when his own commanders were tired of the fighting.
They did. Forbes Mance, a leading scholar on Timur, points this out. And in a stunning display of prioritizing loot over governance, he was known to plunder regions that were nominally already subjugated just so he could acquire wealth again.
Wait, he'd plunder his own territories?
Or at least territories that had already sworn allegiance and paid tribute. If the money ran low, the resource acquisition was more important than the diplomatic status of that territory. He'd just go back and take more.
So if he was so selective about where he established permanent rule, the policy spectrum as you call it, where did he choose to stick around? And what was the defining difference between those places and, say, India?
There is a very sharp operational divide you can see in the source material. The lands he left alone were subject only to what we can call tribute or chastisement. These were the great peripheral conquests: India, Syria, Anatolia, the steppe.
The smash and grab targets.
Basically. These were the rich, far-flung targets where the immediate financial reward was high, but the administrative headaches and the distance from Samarkand were simply too great to be worth the trouble.
Okay, so then what about the lands he incorporated directly?
These were his core territories: Fergana, Khorasan, Western Iran, and Iraq. The key structural reason was similarity. These territories were culturally and politically similar to his core power base, the Ulus Chagatai.
The Chagatai Khanates, one of the successor states to the Mongol Empire.
Correct. These lands had mixed populations that had previously been ruled by Chinggisid dynasties. This meant Timur and his Chagatai emirs could adapt to and rule them directly with relative ease. They could often just plug into pre-existing administrative and tax frameworks without having to invent a whole new system. It was the path of least institutional resistance.
That makes perfect sense for settled populations. You can tax a city. But this brings us back to what you call the unsolvable tribal problem, which is critical for explaining why he couldn't hold the vast steppes of the Golden Horde.
And this structural difficulty is really the Achilles heel of Timurid expansion. Gaining new resources through conquest needed to be balanced against the political cost of incorporating new elites and tribal opponents.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in his core region, the Ulus Chagatai, Timur had already effectively broken the traditional power of the great nomadic tribes. He'd restructured them.
Okay, he'd centralized power away from the tribal leaders and to himself.
Yes, while still preserving their nomadic lifestyle. But he couldn't export that model. He was completely unable to replicate that success against powerful, intact nomad confederations like the Golden Horde or the Korakuyunlu in the West.
Why not? He beat them in battle repeatedly.
Because military defeat alone was simply insufficient to destroy these groups. You could beat their army in a battle, but their social structure and their economic base, their herds, their grazing lands, remained largely intact. To achieve permanent subjugation, Timur needed to do more than just defeat their leaders in the field.
He needed to co-opt their manpower.
He needed to attract their members away from their traditional tribal chiefs and into his own army.
And his army structure offered no incentive for them to defect or join him.
Precisely. His army, having had its own internal tribal power dismantled back home in the Ulis Shagate, was no longer organized along traditional tribal lines. For a large nomad confederation, this meant that joining Timur's structure required entering in a clearly subordinate position. They'd be stripped of their autonomy, their traditional leadership roles, their identity.
And that would be completely unacceptable to a proud leader like Tontamish of the Golden Horde.
Highly unattractive, to say the least. So he could conquer the land, but he couldn't assimilate the people on terms that were acceptable to them. He conquered the vast areas of nomad population in Mogolistan and the Dashti Kipchak multiple times, yet he never permanently incorporated them.
So his victories over his most powerful nomad opponents were always temporary.
And they could not last beyond his death because he failed to effectively integrate their manpower. Settled populations could be subdued and their administrations utilized with little change, but nomadic tribal populations required the prior destruction of their internal tribal structure. And Timur simply couldn't achieve or enforce that outside his original, already restructured domains.
So the very thing that made his core power base so effective, a centralized, non-tribal army, was the very thing that prevented the empire from expanding permanently into other tribal territories.
It's a perfect paradox. His strength was also his greatest limitation.
Moving from the structural limits of his empire to, well, the peak military demonstration of his power, we have to focus on the Battle of Ankara in 1402. This victory had massive geopolitical implications. It led directly to the capture of the Ottoman Sultan.
And the decentralization of the previously rapidly centralizing Ottoman state. It was an absolute cataclysm for the Ottomans.
It ushered in what's known as the Fetret Devri, the Ottoman interregnum, a period of civil war that lasted over a decade. Timur effectively reversed Bayezid's imperial ambitions, restored the former Anatolian mayors, and left the Ottoman state severely limited.
And this event created immediate problems for chroniclers and diplomats across the Islamic world. The challenge was, how do you describe a pious conqueror like Timur, who claimed to be the sword of Islam, destroying the power of the most successful Islamic state on its frontier with the Christian West?
It's a major PR problem.
A huge one. And this brings us to a crucial historical source written a century and a half later by Mu'ayya al-Din al-Lari.
Now, Lari presents a fascinating historical paradox. He was a 16th century immigrant from Safavid territory who settled in the Ottoman Empire and wrote a universal history dedicated to Sultan Selim II.
A direct descendant of the very Bayezid of whom Timur had captured and, humiliated.
Exactly. And despite writing for the Ottoman court, Lowry maintained a fiercely pro-Timurid stance. How was that possible?
He was deeply influenced by the Persianate traditions that revered Timur for his cultural patronage, and he had access to specific Timurid sources. So he was walking a political tightrope, trying to honor his patron while simultaneously defending Timur's legacy.
So Al-Luri's narrative serves as a kind of official, sanitized defense of Timur, portraying him as the reluctant warrior.
That's a perfect way to put it.
What were his core claims about the lead-up to Ankara? How did he justify it?
Lari's claims are designed to absolve Timur of responsibility for attacking a fellow Muslim power. He argues that Timur consistently avoided warfare against Bayezid. He claims Timur's primary focus was fighting non-Muslims, the Franks, and that his troops were simply too exhausted for another major campaign.
So he's suggesting Timur wanted a partnership, not a fight.
That's the spin. Lari portrays Timur as actively seeking to join forces with Bayezid against the infidels. He famously cites a letter Timur supposedly sent to Bayezid that asserts Timur's global dominion, and explicitly advises the Sultan to avoid conflict with the Turks, implicitly the Timurids, by using a respected Islamic saying, the Edith, leave the Turks until the time when they leave you. It was a diplomatic maneuver masked by piety, a veiled threat.
Wait, so Timur uses scripture to tell Bayezid to back off, framing the whole conflict as being Bayezid's fault if it happens. And what about Timur's actual demands, the things that started the conflict? Laurie characterized those as superficial.
He did. Lori claimed Timur's demands like surrendering the exiled political opponents Ar-Yusuf and Ahmad-Jalair and handing over the fortress of Komak were merely superficial pretexts. He argued they were designed to be refused, but not actually vital to Timur's goals.
The implication being that Timur was just testing him.
The implication was that Timur was merely seeking Bayezid's acknowledgement of a shared Islamic objective and would have stopped short of a full-scale invasion if Bayezid had just shown some deference.
But if we move away from Laurie's politically expedient account and look at contemporary sources, especially those reflecting the Ottoman position, the picture changes entirely. What was the Ottoman reality of Timur's intentions?
Other contemporary sources, including the very detailed accounts of a writer named Ibn Norabsha, they corroborate that Timur's true ambition was far grander and much more immediate: the acquisition of Anatolia and the explicit subjugation of the Ottoman Empire.
So Ar-Yusuf and Ahmad-Jalair were indeed pretexts.
They were fig leaves, convenient excuses used to conceal his real imperial intentions.
So the demand wasn't just diplomatic, it was a non-negotiable claim of sovereignty.
Absolutely. Timur persistently escalated his demands until they reached an intolerable level for Bayezid. He eventually required Bayezid to recognize him as the supreme sovereign and accept the title of Amir al-Umara of the Muslims, the commander of commanders.
And for Bayezid, who saw himself as the champion of Islam against the West.
Accepting that term would have meant forfeiting his entire imperial status. He would become Timur's vassal. It was an impossible demand.
And the response from the Ottoman court. How did their historians record this?
Ottoman historians, people like Nurzri and Hocasaddin, they confirm that Bayezid refused these terms unequivocally. They viewed Timur's persistent, escalating demands as a clear intent to cause trouble and distress.
So they saw it for what it was.
They believed the demands were designed specifically to provoke a conflict under conditions advantageous to Timur, knowing Bayezid couldn't possibly accept them without complete and total humiliation. The war, from the Ottoman perspective, was an act of raw aggression and a pure power assertion.
Now, let's talk about the diplomatic fallout after the battle. The historical spin surrounding Bayezid's death in captivity seems almost more important than the battle itself.
The necessity of preserving Timur's heroic image continued even after Bayezid died in captivity in 1403. It was crucial. Larry specifically reported that Timur was deeply upset by the Sultan's death. He says Timur offered profuse condolences and, critically, stated that he never intended to divide Bayezid's territories into principalities.
That is a direct rhetorical response to the fact that Timur did divide the territories.
Yeah.
He restored all the former Anatolian beyliks, which is the very definition of decentralizing the Ottoman state.
It is historical damage control, plain and simple. Laurie's narrative attempts to argue that even though the Ottoman state fragmented, which it objectively did, Timur never intended for that to happen. It was an unforeseen consequence.
Which is just not believable.
Not at all. And to complete the picture, Laurie goes so far as to suggest that Bayezid confessed regret just before his death for having faced Timur in battle. This completes the heroic image of Timur. Powerful, skillful, pious, and yet fundamentally generous and reluctant to fight a fellow Muslim ruler. It's a narrative carefully constructed for a later audience, trying to legitimize Timur's overwhelming victory and minimize the political cost.
So Timur's political decisions achieved the division. But his historical record, or at least this version of it, claimed he intended the opposite. It really shows how the record of a conqueror, even centuries later, is often a tool used to justify power and diminish the trauma of those he defeated.
It's a masterclass in political spin.
What's truly fascinating here, and I think we need to shift to this, is that the man responsible for this staggering violence and this kind of strategic administration was not just a warrior. The source material presents Timur as an utterly unique leader, a management genius who deployed not one, but a complex spectrum of 5 distinct leadership styles simultaneously.
The sheer adaptability required to run an empire based on personal dominance over such diverse peoples necessitated this flexibility. He was a leader who understood that different political challenges required radically different authoritative approaches. It really elevates him beyond the simple label of warlord.
Let's start with the one that seems most counterintuitive, his ethical leadership style. How does a man who builds towers of skulls maintain any kind of ethical front?
Well, it refers primarily to his relationship with legitimacy and tradition. You see, Timur was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan.
Which in that world was everything.
It was the only source of ultimate legitimacy. It meant he could never legally claim the title Khan. This was a foundational political constraint, so his ethical leadership meant exhibiting humility and respecting that established political tradition. He installed a puppet Khan from the lineage of Ögedei Khan instead.
So he rules, but someone else wears the crown.
Exactly. He settled only for the title Amir, or Great Amir. He used this ethical observance, adhering to the Chinggisid law, as a pragmatic tool for legitimacy. It ensured he operated under the giant shadow of the Chagatai Khanate, lending his rule the necessary Mongol legitimacy in the eyes of his key Turco-Mongol constituencies, without crossing the political line of claiming a title he wasn't entitled to.
And there was a personal component to this as well, right? About honesty.
Yes, his personal adherence to a kind of righteousness was expressed by the signet ring he wore. It was constantly engraved with the phrase rasti or resti, which means honesty is the salvation. The sources say he genuinely hated lies and people who lied to him, and he enforced this behavioral standard even in the context of his often brutal diplomacy.
But how did that moral rigor, or at least the appearance of it, interact with the necessity of terror? That brings us right to his authoritarian leadership style.
The authoritarian style was the mechanism for absolute control. This timer was serious, determined, and demanded immediate, absolute obedience. There was no room for discussion once an order was given.
So he was unforgiving.
Utterly unforgiving of slight opposition or even minor errors, the sources note he disliked jokes and purposefully maintained social distance from everyone, from his highest emirs to the lowliest soldier, to reinforce his position as the unique master.
The terror, then, wasn't just random destruction. It was a consequence of failing to meet that demand for absolute obedience.
Exactly. It was a tool of enforcement. Cities and people that obeyed his commands to the letter remained safe. Those that showed even the smallest sign of opposition were systematically destroyed. He would fight opponents with pleasure, specifically to achieve this sense of absolute dominance and take revenge on those who dared to challenge his authority. This style was essential for the rapid coordination and loyalty of the vast, diverse forces he commanded.
Okay, now for the true aha moment from the sources. The third style. Democratic leadership. Finding democratic principles within a ruthless despot is, well, it's shocking.
It sounds completely contradictory, but it was highly strategic. Before undertaking any major campaign, Timur would consult extensively with his state officials and commanders. He would hold a kurultay, a traditional Mongol assembly.
And he'd actually listen.
He granted them the right to speak freely in parliament, believing that a comprehensive discussion of all potential outcomes would prevent future regrets or failures. This wasn't democracy for the sake of sharing power, though. This was democracy applied for effectiveness.
So he was crowdsourcing intelligence, seeking input to stress test his own ideas and ensure buy-in, but he never yielded the final decision.
That's the blend. While he granted them the right to speak as much as they wanted, the final decision always skillfully combined his own pre-existing idea with the consultation's outcome. He made sure the ultimate decision aligned with his wish, but that it had benefited from expert, unfiltered input. He blended a democratic process with absolute control, which made the final action much more effective and robust.
That adaptability connects directly to his core motivation, which the sources term his visionary leadership. This seems to be the engine driving everything else.
It was. His vision was the relentless drive behind all his actions. It was clear, consistent, and absolute to be the unique master of the world. He believed profoundly in the ancient idea that the world could not and should not serve two masters.
A zero-sum game.
Completely. This intense, unyielding perspective motivated him to endure continuous, decades-long campaigns. He would repeatedly attack opponents until they were completely subjugated or destroyed. There was no concept of a negotiated peace with an equal.
You mentioned earlier he attacked the Kipchak Khan 4 times. That level of tenacity stems directly from this zero-sum visionary approach.
It does. It wasn't just military conquest. It was about achieving a psychological state of absolute victory where no one could plausibly challenge his status as the supreme ruler. The relentless nature of his campaigns was simply the operationalization of this vision.
And finally, his strategic leadership style. This emphasizes preparation and intelligence gathering, and it reveals the immense logistical planning behind the seemingly chaotic destruction.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of his wars, His strategic planning was exceptionally sophisticated. The sources are clear. He would never initiate a major attack without gathering highly detailed intelligence first.
So he had a spy network.
A vast network of news aggregators and spies. These operatives were disguised in a multitude of professions. Dervishes, traveling merchants, astrologers, artists, even wrestlers. They would infiltrate the social fabric of his rivals' countries.
That's a deep intelligence apparatus. What kind of information were they providing him?
Everything. Major political issues, the demographics of cities and towns, the morale of prominent people, the economic health of the regions, the state of the roads, the location of water sources. Furthermore, his command structure was always prepared for the unexpected. He had the documented ability to withstand sudden, localized attacks instantly, which indicates a state of constant, high-level preparation and monitoring of the external environment. He was always assessing opportunities and threats.
He treated warfare like a vast, ongoing, real-time business operation.
That's a great way to describe it. And this strategic genius manifested directly on the field. He was an excellent war tactician. He introduced completely new combat techniques and unusual troop deployments. Most notably, he would send his soldiers into battle in 7 great units. This was a complex, layered structure unknown to his contemporaries, who were used to a simpler center and flanks formation. This created confusion and allowed for complex maneuvers.
So he wasn't just relying on brute force, he was relying on superior command and control.
Exactly. He personally sketched his own battle formations. He maintained real-time awareness of the enemy's formation, and he personally led the precise timing of attacks, withdrawals, and splits on enemy lines himself from a high vantage point. His communication and discipline systems were impeccable, enabling rapid and frequently changing attacks that confused and overwhelmed traditional armies.
That level of tactical brilliance requires immense loyalty from his subordinate commanders. It's one thing to have a plan, it's another to get thousands of men to execute it flawlessly under pressure. How did he ensure that loyalty was maintained across decades of grueling campaigns?
That brings us to his sophisticated use of what we'd call reward power. He was highly adept at utilizing incentives to bind his men to him. It wasn't just fear, it was also greed.
So, cash bonuses.
In a way, right before engaging in a major battle, he would distribute extravagant gifts, called ulage, to increase troop enthusiasm and motivation. It was a pre-battle morale boost.
But there must have been a more structural system for the top commanders.
There was. A much more significant system was for rewarding his key subordinates, who are referred to in the sources as benefit providers, or siurgaler. These individuals were given tax-exempt land grants.
Okay, a classic reward.
But crucially, they also acquired the right to collect taxes within those territories, taxes which would have previously gone directly to the state treasury.
Ah, so that's more than just a military salary. It's decentralized wealth creation that binds the elites directly to him. He's giving them a piece of the action.
It's a powerful motivational tool. By granting these land and tax rights, he ensured the loyalty of his key subordinates through guaranteed financial power, prestige, and land ownership. It reinforced his overall management perspective that rewarded aggressive success and personal loyalty above all else. This system helped maintain the cohesion of an otherwise highly disparate and geographically dispersed elite.
So far, we have discussed Timur, the strategist, the manager, and the geopolitical pragmatist. Now we have to address the sheer depth of the contradiction within his legacy. The unparalleled scale of his atrocities set against the simultaneous, spectacular cultural revival he sponsored.
And the sources are absolutely unequivocal. He is widely considered one of history's most brutal butchers. When you look at the scale of the slaughter, it's truly difficult to grasp the numbers.
What are we talking about exactly?
The historical estimates are staggering. It is suggested that his troops may have slaughtered up to 17 million people across his campaigns.
17 million.
A figure that some historians estimate represented about 5% of the world's population at the time. And to be clear, this wasn't simple military violence. His massacres were calculated acts of strategic terror designed to instantly crush opposition, instill paralyzing fear, and eliminate any possibility of future resistance.
And the specific examples of this calculated terror are chilling because they illustrate a kind of ruthless, almost legalistic precision in his cruelty.
They do. Consider Baghdad. His forces beheaded an estimated 90,000 inhabitants. This was done explicitly so that his engineers could construct towers or pyramids of human skulls. It was a visible, tangible monument to his power and the cost of opposition. This was pure psychological warfare broadcast across the continent.
Or the example at Sivas in Turkey, which speaks to a terrible, dark humor in his cruelty.
Right. The sources report that when the garrison at Sivas surrendered, Timur promised them no bloodshed.
A promise he technically kept.
He had 3,000 prisoners, mostly Armenian soldiers, buried alive. He could then point out that technically he had kept his oath. No blood was shed. This was designed to spread a reputation for cunning and terrible, unyielding power. The message was that not only would he kill you, but he would do it in a way that mocked your hope. It ensured that subsequent cities would surrender without a fight.
And he justified all this through a veneer of religious zealotry.
His official justification was always that he was the sword of Islam. He was fighting non-believers Hindus during the invasion of India or Christians in Georgia. However, since he frequently attacked and slaughtered fellow Muslims like those in Iraq, Syria, and Persia,
He had to have an excuse for that, too.
they were always conveniently described as bad Muslims or heretics who had failed to adhere to the true faith. This religious justification was a powerful motivational tool for his Turco-Mongol army, and it lent an air of divine legitimacy to his otherwise purely political ambitions.
Yet, contrasted violently against this brutality, we have this magnificent flourishing of culture, science, and art. The Timurid Renaissance. How could one man preside over both the worst acts of destruction and the highest peak of regional culture simultaneously?
This deep contrast is the paradox that secures his enduring historical significance. Timur was a great builder and a great patron of the arts. His method was to systematically destroy opposition and cities. Critically, he would spare and forcibly transport all skilled artisans, scholars, artists, and architects from the conquered lands. He would round them up in cities like Damascus, Delhi, or Baghdad, and march them back to Samarkand, his capital.
So he was looting talent, not just gold.
Exactly. His goal was unambiguous. He was determined to make Samarkand the most beautiful city in the world, and he was going to do it with the best minds and hands his conquests could provide.
And this led to the Timurid Renaissance.
The 15th century Timurid Renaissance, driven by this mass influx of talent and immense patronage, truly matched the intellectual and aesthetic splendor of the Italian Quattrocento. It was primarily sustained by his son Shah Rukh and his grandson Ulu Beg after Timur's death, but Timur laid the foundation.
And Samarkand, as a result, became this beacon of architectural innovation.
Absolutely. The main architectural marvels included the construction of his summer palace, the colossal Bibi Khanim Mosque, and the Registan, the public square that Lord Curzon, the 19th century viceroy of India, famously described as the noblest public square in the world.
And the style was very distinctive, wasn't it?
Overwhelmingly, the architecture emphasized the color blue. It utilized spectacular Persian blue-tiled mosaics and complex geometric patterns, which became the hallmark of the Timurid style.
And the scientific contributions, particularly from his grandson Ulo Beg, went far beyond aesthetics. They went right into the foundations of modern mathematics and astronomy.
Ulu Beg wasn't just a patron. He was an outstanding polymath in his own right, a brilliant astronomer and mathematician. Between 1424 and 1429, he established the Samarkand Astronomical Observatory. This observatory was equipped with instruments, like a massive fixed meridian arc that had no functional equivalent in the Western world at the time.
That's phenomenal. What was the lasting scientific impact?
He is renowned for the quality and accuracy of his star catalog and his trigonometric tables. They were so significant and so precise that a lunar crater and the asteroid 22439 are named after him to this day.
Wow.
And this flourishing was also seen in literature with the development of Shagate Turkic as a sophisticated literary language, later famously used by his descendant Babur to write his memoirs, the Baburnama. Miniature paintings and murals also flourished, and their influence spread as far west as Anatolia, seen in places like the Green Complex in Bursa. The cultural legacy was clearly intended to establish a glorious long-term memory that would transcend and perhaps redeem his destructive path.
Yet, despite all this effort to create a lasting cultural center, the political empire itself remained short-lived. It really proves it was never more than an expression of his personal dominance.
Correct. And the ultimate symbol of his prioritizing conquest over governance was his final act. He died in 1405 in Kazakhstan.
And what was he doing there?
He was leading a massive 200,000-strong expedition aimed at conquering the Ming dynasty of China.
Even at the end of his life, he was planning his biggest conquest yet.
And the entire Chinese campaign was instantly abandoned upon the news of his death. The focus of his emirs immediately shifted to the inevitable civil war among his heirs. The project died with the man.
And his final resting place.
His body was taken back to Samarkand and interred in the Guri Amir Mausoleum under a monumental 6-foot slab of black jade. The inscription is the final testament to his vision of himself. It reads, "This is the resting place of the illustrious and merciful monarch, Lord Timur, conqueror of the world." The self-designation tells you everything about his single-minded ambition.
And that single-minded focus on immediate, decisive conquest leads us to his most profound indirect legacy, especially in South Asia.
His invasion of India in 1398, which was a quick, brutal, loot-driven raid, shattered the Delhi Sultanate. It led to widespread anarchy, famine, pestilence, and created a profound political vacuum across northern India that lasted for over a century.
And that wasn't an accident. He intended to gather riches and leave chaos in his wake.
But that chaos ultimately acted as a kind of political field preparation for his own dynasty.
How so?
The weakness and fragmentation he deliberately left behind made it vastly easier for his great-great-great-grandson, Babur, to exploit that fragmented political landscape in 1526 and establish the Mughal Empire.
So Timur built towers of skulls and avoided the burden of administration in India, yet the destruction he wrought set the stage for one of history's most lasting and spectacular imperial dynasties, founded by his own descendant long after the centralized core of his own empire had vanished.
It's one of history's greatest ironies. His short-term strategy created the conditions for his dynasty's long-term success.
So if we summarize Timur's life, we see him as the epitome of the destructive yet profoundly creative conqueror.
His strategic genius lay not just in winning battles, but in knowing precisely when to strike for maximum immediate gain loot, tribute, and the destruction of rivals' power, and when to strategically withdraw. He avoided the immense long-term governance challenges, particularly the need to assimilate hostile tribal confederations in his non-core territories. He understood that true dominance could be achieved through fear without the long-term cost of administration.
And the truly surprising insight for us, for you, the listener, is that his success wasn't merely brute force. We've seen that adaptability was central to everything he did, proven by his sophisticated application of 5 different leadership styles. The authoritarian warlord, who simultaneously used strategic intelligence gathering and democratic consultation to ensure the highest quality of decision-making.
That blend ensured his dominance could adapt to any situation. He was a master of his time, applying what we would today recognize as highly advanced management science and logistical strategy to the task of continental conquest and personal aggrandizement.
This leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider. Timur consciously avoided building a permanent state in India. He sought only fear and riches. Yet the chaos he left behind ultimately allowed his own bloodline to return a century later and found the Mughal Empire, a political legacy far more permanent and lasting than the centralized empire he had consciously avoided building. So the question is, what other historical figures, focused intensely on achieving one disruptive, immediate goal, inadvertently set the stage for a completely unexpected, monumental, long-term global change that defined their dynasty for centuries to come? Think about that as you continue your own deep dive into history.